Thank you, Benny. Wonderful. Well, welcome to everyone who is here, and thank you for your patience as we try to figure out these technical issues. These are the days. Okay, I'll speak a little louder. And is the Zoom active? Yay, well, welcome to you on Zoom. I'm Reverend Cynthia Powell, an aspiring humanist, which are Joe's words, a longtime member of the Church of Humanism, a graduate of the Humanist Theological Seminary, and an ordained minister of the church, and a longtime friend of Joe and Alyson Ben-David. I think we can all agree that Joe was a great human being, one who had a profound effect on us, and whose unique perspective on everything caused us to open our eyes more widely, our ears more acutely, and our hearts more receptively. I want to share with you some of my fondest memories of Joe. One of them was when he and I went up to the Palisades and we were recording the sound of a stream for his presentation. It was a one-man show called Jesus on Broadway, and it was his trial and vindication. So that was really unique. It was terrific. The other memory that I have that I hold fondly in my heart was when I was helping Joe prepare a bunch of buttons in the 80s when he had purchased a button-making machine. And so we decided we were going to go in the button-making business, and here are some of the slogans that Joe had come up with. Christmas kills Christ. God hates yarmulkes and crosses. Kosher slaughter is animal torture. God likes sex. Stop the necrophilia in the media. And my favorite, the commercialization of Christmas is the crucifixion of Christ. That gets them. You can get a sense of the humor that he imbued in everything that he did, and yet the seriousness of his take on cherished taboos and conventional thinking. He was an idol smasher, like the best of the prophets, an iconoclast who made you think and who made you blink. He helped me through a very hard time in my life, and the things that I learned from Joe have carried me through my entire life. I'm grateful to him for his generous sharing of his immense knowledge with me, and I'm sure with you. Our service will continue with reminiscences about Joe and important chapters of his life. We'll have a little flower ceremony commemorating these beautiful bouquets that you have made with your flowers, symbolizing our communal appreciation of Joe. And there are a number of people that we want to acknowledge today, especially Joe's 5 grandchildren, Rebecca Ben-David, Danny Ben-David, oh, I'm sorry, Benny Ben-David, who also just played, Julian Grabarek, Gwen Grabarek, and Price Grabarek, and of course his son Dan. Where's Dan? There he is. There. We also remember beautiful Iris Ben-David, Joe and Alyson's daughter, who left us 7 years ago after her battle with cancer. And now I'm pleased to introduce, I don't know exactly what's happening, but I'm hoping, according to our schedule, we're going to hear from the Reverend Darrell Berger, who was the former senior minister here at the Fourth UU Society, who will be delivering a message, a eulogy in honor of Joe. Thank you.
I was minister of the Fourth Universalist Society of New York City from 1989 to 1999, when Joe and Alyson Ben-David became members. It changed the congregation forever, and it changed me forever. Alyson became a wise and active leader and board member. Joe became a mentor to me and to the entire congregation. They showed us how to turn love, compassion, and the longing for justice into action. Joe's essay, A Brief History of Humanism, is a virtuoso explanation of how humanism developed from ancient Egypt to Erich Fromm. Whenever there is a social or political movement of justice and compassion, even today, it invariably traces its most dynamic moments to the values of humanism. When I became a Unitarian Universalist minister in 1973, while there were vestiges of liberal Christianity, the dominant struggle for meaning was between secular humanism and religious humanism, with secular humanism on the ascent. This stressed art, music, and poetry in worship, but no ritual, no reference to world religions other than to debunk. The minister's message was often called a talk or lecture rather than a sermon. Then came the women and Joe Ben-David. As the number of women studying for ministry and taking organizational leadership positions increased, so did religious humanism begin to stand with the rational, scientific, and materialistic secular version. The flaming chalice, the Unitarian Universalist logo, jumped off denominational stationery and began to be lit at the beginning of worship. Chanting, adult education classes, teaching the old forms of religion before the imposition of the patriarchy, became central to Unitarian Universalist organizations and even their approach to social justice. This fit right in with Ben-David's idea of humanism. There's no better example of the kind of universal humanist ritual than the flower communion, created by Joe's friend and mentor from the Unitarian Church of Prague, Norbert Čapek. The flower communion is now presented in just about all Unitarian Universalist congregations. Central to Joe's values was, of course, his mentor, Martin Buber's I and Thou, which I think of as a Western version of the Hindu Namaste greeting, or the divine in me salutes the divine in you. To much of humanism, the very idea of divine is subject to suspicion, if not folly. Which brings us to the central issue of Joe's life and teachings. Why a church of humanism, of all things? Isn't this a contradiction? Why use an organizational model that many humanists would say is at the root of much of the world's suffering and hypocrisy? Without assuming more knowledge of Joe's motives and ideas than I have, I think I have some idea, having been minister to several Unitarian Universalist churches that have been, in their own ways, churches of humanism. Churches amplify and multiply the values of their members. There is at the core an expectation that one brings one's values into the world. They are not just academic discussion groups or sanctuaries of individual study. Churches also have an explicit expectation that members look out for each other, care about each other, and extend that care even to those outside the group. Therefore, a church of humanism worth its name has the potential to widen and deepen the values of humanism and to bring an activist and community aspect to the group that is different than groups which meet only for individual edification and development. Of course, this also means that the Church of Humanism may also fall victim to all the organizational ills of other churches, whether it be failure to act on their principles, subversion of their minister to personal agendas, or just plain inability to get out of its own way. Joe Ben-David was one of the people who lived their values to a very high extent. In this way, he helped the Church of Humanism and the Fourth Universalist Society understand and act more profoundly in bringing its values into the world. He lived in the I-thou as much as any person I have ever met. For instance, he was particularly kind to me. He helped me to grow spiritually, take more chances personally and professionally in the name of growth and conscience, and to go easier on myself when things didn't go as I anticipated. The current word for many relationships today is transactional. What do I get out of it? What's in it for me? The exact opposite of the I-thou, which is why the I-thou could use even more teaching today. We have made too many of our relationships based on commerce rather than community. Joe was very quiet. His voice was soft and his smile benevolent. He was very friendly and warm. Upon first meeting him, one might think he was the most harmless, if well-meaning person imaginable. But once you got to know him, you realized that Joe Ben-David was steel. He was tireless. He was relentless. He did what the moment required. In this way, he showed our congregation how to create social justice, not just ask for it. He showed how to bring values and aspirations into the world. He changed this church for the better. He changed me for the better. He changed the world for the better. I take a small part of him with me everywhere as a talisman of courage, compassion, and the will to make myself a better person and the world a better world.
Hi, I'm Alyson Ben-David, and I'm having a little trouble keeping the tears away. That was very wonderful of Darrell. I really appreciated it. They were friends. He was the senior minister here when we first joined, and Joe and Darrell were friends, and he was the senior minister when we joined. And anyway, he was the first person I called when I decided to move forward with the program. And he said yes. Unfortunately, he was not able to be here. And before I go on to, well, the next thing I'm supposed to say, I want to mention that Joe died in October of 2020, and two other long-time members of this church died within the next month and a half. And because of COVID, I don't think that either of them was able to have a memorial or service in this church. So I'm going to mention both of them. One of them is Cora Kronemeyer, who was a wonderful artist, and any of you who were around remember her vividly, and she became sick and died pretty quickly. But there's a tie-dye hanging of hers out there. We haven't quite put the label underneath it yet, but it's by her. It's called Rhapsody in Blue, and it's a gorgeous tie-dye of shades of blue that's sparkled with sequins, so it looks like the sky. And I have it from one of our auctions, and I have kept it hanging. And every time I see it, it makes me think of her and makes me smile. But it is out there. And the other person is Hannah Jones, who's the wife of Bob Jones. Bob is sitting back there. Would you like to stand up? And there is a picture of Bob and Hannah. That's Bob Jones. He and I were very much involved in the treasury of the church for a long time together and became good friends. And it was terrible that we both lost our spouses about a week or two apart. So now I am going to go to the next part I'm supposed to say, and that is not especially cheerful. Now, if I can figure out the order of these pages. There. Oh. No. Joseph was born in 1920. His mother, Karolina, was a gracious woman from the Bohemia area of what's now the Czech Republic. His father, Gustav, was a successful printer and ink maker. Joe, whose nickname was Pepek, and his younger brother, Bertik, were fully aware of their Jewish heritage. Prague's famous old Jewish cemetery, which opened in the year 1437, and one of the only cemeteries to survive Hitler, is where the historic Rabbi Lev, who reportedly created the golem, for those of you who know about the golem, is entombed. And in addition, Prague's Gothic medieval Altneuschule is the oldest synagogue in Europe that remains active as a synagogue today. And these are things that he brought me and Iris to see when we were the three of us there together. And Joe was largely self-educated. He found his self-education more interesting than his school. And he read a lot of historic and modern Western philosophers and theologians on his own as a teen. And I want to read to you the opening of Joseph's as yet unpublished memoir. He writes his words. The greatest horror of my life experience was, of course, the rise and tyranny of Hitlerism. The Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia on March 15th, 1937, marching across Prague's great landmark, the Charles Bridge. And there's a picture of Joe and Dan standing on the Charles Bridge back there, a photograph of the two of them, much more recent picture. So, at the time that they invaded, I was standing, this is Joe again, I was standing at a meeting, I was in a meeting of the Czech Unitaria youth in the Unitarian Society headquarters. We were so nearby that we heard the rattling of the panzer wagons going across the Charles Bridge up to the castle. Later that day, when I arrived home, I was shocked once again to learn that my father had died that same day of a heart attack in the electric tram. Let me just add that Joseph's personal mentor and brave inspiration, as has Darrell already mentioned, at that time was the founder and leader of the Czech Unitarian Society, Norbert Čapek, who died from medical experimentation by the Nazis after Joe had left for Palestine.
This is a song my father sings in Czech. He was a Unitarian in the 1930s in Prague. His minister was Norbert Čapek, who wrote this song, Mother Spirit, Father Spirit. It's page 8 in the Unitarian hymnal. Father Spirit, where are you? In the sky song, in the forest sounds your cry. What to give you, what to call you, am I? Many drops are in the ocean deep. Sunlight bounces off the ripples to the sky. What to give you, what to call you, what am I?
Hello, everybody. I'm going to kick off the next section of our ceremony today. Can you all hear me? Okay. All right. Let me make sure I'm on the right page here. So Joseph, also known as Grandpa Joe, and Pepek, to us grandchildren, fled the Nazis on the last illegal transport from Prague under the quote-unquote escort of armed Nazi guards by train and then by boat. The guards abandoned this transport of 1,000 to 2,000 desperate refugees, leaving them to survive a frozen winter on the Black Sea on an unheated barge with next to no food. Joseph's mother and grandmother stayed behind and unfortunately did not survive the Nazis. Here with my father Dan, my brother Benny, and myself, we also remember Joseph's second wife, Erica Alyson Ben-David, who died very soon after he did in 2021. Erica was a refugee from Vienna. Her transport from Austria to British Palestine was in fact quite worse and longer than Joe's, and her parents, also refugees from Vienna, emigrated to the US after the war. Growing up in a family with grandparents and with great-grandparents who escaped the Nazi tyranny or unfortunately died at their hands impacted my brother and me very strongly. We became aware at an early age of the impact of generational trauma, both on the body and the spirit, and the challenge of carrying those pains through life. Despite that, though, we also learned to cultivate love and resilience in their wake. And that's certainly the message that stays with me when I think of my grandfather today.
After Joseph's refugee ship reached British Palestine, he began investing energy and effort and bringing together individuals of different faiths with the goal of fostering dialogue, mutual understanding, and mutual respect. Among the prominent people he reached out to was the famous existential philosopher and theologian Martin Buber. Joe's effort was very much aligned with Buber's working to build peace between the Jews and the Palestinians. Professor Buber's organization was called Ichud, meaning union. Ichud was historically most significant peace group in Palestine. He attended their meetings, which included major peace leaders. When he was preparing to go to the US, the Ichud members asked him to help build American interest and support in Ichud's goal to bring peace. Emigrating to the US in 1954, Joseph continued to devote most of his volunteer work to Ichud at their request. He devoted hours a day for 4 years and founded American Friends of Ichud. He mobilized and integrated a group of prominent peoples that included Erich Fromm, Norman Thomas, Hans Kohn, Hannah Arendt, and Roger Baldwin. Their public meetings focused on creating a binational state of Israelis and Palestinians were often met with great hostility. In 1958, Buber's 80th birthday was celebrated at the UU Community Church in New York City, filled to overflowing. Joe taped this historically significant birthday talk. Buber emphasized the positive aspect of early Zionism, but criticized its ethical decline in recent years. After returning to Israel, Buber was put under enormous pressure to rewrite his speech, and his rewritten speech was widely distributed in the Jewish press. That was one of Buber's last speeches. Tragically, he died several months later, which led to the dissolution of Ichud.
How does one encapsulate a life well lived, such that those who come after, or those who, like me, came along late in the life of the Reverend Joseph Ben-David, can begin to understand and appreciate the scope and significance of that life? We do what we're doing today, sharing and telling parts of the story of Joe's life that illustrate how the arc of history, as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King reminded us, bends toward justice. At the age of 17, Joe became a refugee, a young man of Jewish origins, escaping growing hatred, severe actions, and increasing thoughts as the Nazi movement accelerated in his homeland. A small piece of what I know of Joe's life is that he and 1,000 to 2,000 other Jews bribed Nazi officials to let them leave on the last illegal train leaving Czechoslovakia. He ended up in British Palestine. Joe was already doing his life's work, a leader among the youth who spoke out in his first public talk at an anti-Nazi rally. For the remainder of his long and eventful life, Reverend Joe would continue a tireless commitment as participant and front row witness in the pursuit of human rights. Today, As a convenient and credible overview of Reverend Joe's lifelong commitment to social justice, I'll share with you a synopsis of his work on the day that he was awarded the Winifred Latimer Norman Award in Social Justice. In May of 1997, the Fourth Universalist Society nominated Reverend Joe for this honor, an award created by an honored ancestor of our congregation whose own family legacy was grounded in social justice and the work for racial equity. Reverend Joe's work continued for more than 2 decades following the presentation of this prestigious award, but Douglas Rhodes, then president of the Unitarian Universalist District of Metropolitan New York, offered a summation that is both grounded in history and validated by continuity and by Joe's integrity. I paraphrase. We present this award to the Reverend Joseph Ben-David, Senior Minister of the Church of Humanism and member of the Fourth Universalist Society, who best represents the ideals and values exemplified by Winnie Norman in the areas of social justice and racial concerns. Reverend Joe's award is not easily conveyed only in English, which was his 4th language, but also in his other 3 fluent languages, Czech, German, and Hebrew. Joe's mentors were giants. The Reverend Norbert Fabian Čapek, who was killed at Auschwitz, Professor and famed author Martin Buber, and social psychologist and philosopher Erich Fromm. Reverend Joe learned from them and prodded, challenged, and taught the philosophies of humanism, existentialism, and social justice throughout his long and productive life. Reverend Joe's membership in the Prague Unitaria dated back to 1937, and it is this strand of being to which he devoted himself, helping Czech Unitarians restore the legacy of Dr. Čapek and Dr. Karl Haspel, a dedicated minister who served the people while under the religious restrictions of communist dictatorship. Reverend Joe made it his business to raise up the struggle in Prague to the UUA and to each of us in order to regain the distinguished heritage of that venerable institution. Others more knowledgeable than I have and will speak more of Joe's commitment during our time together today. I will add a personal note here that it was my great honor for Reverend Joe to bring greetings from the Unitarian Church in Czechoslovakia to my ordination in 2007. The breadth of Reverend Joe's social action goes much further. He sought a just peace in the Middle East, promoted healthy attitudes toward human sexuality, fought against the tobacco industry, and served as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Research, Action, and Information Network for the Bodily Integrity of Women. He also founded and served as senior minister of the Church of Humanism in New York. Reverend Joe did not know where his spirit and commitment ended and the rest of the world began. For him, the world, his community, and his dedication to social justice were one and the same. That is a condition to which most of us can only aspire to understand, let alone live. On the day that he was presented the Winifred Norman Latimer Award, and today, we recognize the Reverend Joseph Ben-David for a lifetime of work and commitment to social justice, to action as well as words, to caring deeply about people whom we may not know or perhaps prefer to overlook. People of his caliber are in short supply these days. We appreciate and celebrate Reverend Joe's work and the devotion of his time, his talent, and his treasure to an idea, to a principle, to a just life of hope and opportunity lived for literally millions of people. Amen.
His name was Alexander Sommer Batek. He's a very great guy, really. And he liked me a lot, you see, so he gave me all his books, which I still have. These books traveled with me since that time to Palestine, to the mountains, to America. I still have them till this day in my library here in New York on 85th Street. So from him, I learned something very special. He published a book that had to do with natural religion. And so for the first time, I was introduced into a religion that made sense. It was a religion that had to do with evolution, that had to do with down-to-earth concepts. It had to do with a kind of a humanistic attitude. And not only that, Alexander Sommer Batek told me, "You have to read a book." I said, I'm reading your books. He said, "No, you have to read a book entitled Humanity Ideali, which in English means Humanistic Ideals, by Thomas Garrick Masaryk." Professor Masaryk was a professor of sociology and philosophy who became the president of the first Czechoslovak Republic. And so I read it. I still have it. And when I finished, I came to the conclusion, I am a humanist. See?
In 1966, the humanist era of Joffe Ben-David began. In our meeting halls, the Humanist Society of Greater New York held lectures, discussions, interactive socials. Some were 6 hours long. At the time of and in the framework of the human potential movement. Our Humanist Society had hundreds of members, and meetings were well attended. Joe ran for president of the American Humanist Association, proposing some program changes to strengthen the association. His efforts met with considerable resistance. In 1973, Alyson and Joe founded the Independent Church of Humanism and its division, the Humanist Foundation, continuing to hold various types of meetings for 2 or 3 decades, sometimes as many as 5 meetings a week. They also instituted the Leadership Training Seminar, the Humanist Leadership Training Seminar, and the Humanist Theological Seminary, which was a course of training for people who wanted to expand their knowledge of humanism and all sorts of topics that included psychology, humanistic psychology, socioeconomic issues, and we read many of the most important books written by people like Martin Buber and luminaries of the humanistic psychology movement. Over time, the frequency of meetings slowed down. And in the 90s, Joe and Alyson became members of this church, the Fourth Unitarian Universalist Society. And this church enabled them, allowed them to hold meetings here. And so for many years, weekly meetings continued on here as a component of the Fourth UU programming.
Hello, my name is Julian Grabarek. I am one of Joe's 5 grandchildren. And the next section of this remembrance will focus on how, after many years, my grandfather Joe was finally able to return to Prague to visit his past before he fled from the Nazis. And before we turn our attention to that, we should make a comment about how his father also fought for the independence of the Czech people from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Back in 1918, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled the Czechoslovaks and much of Europe for 300 years, Joseph's father, Gustav, my great-grandfather, was serving in the empire's army. And at the end of World War I, when that empire was in collapse, Gustav was standing in Wenceslas Square, which is this main square in Prague, with his army unit. And as they were deciding what to do, because they knew that their system of government was in collapse, as a proud Czech patriot, my great-grandfather Gustav ripped the insignia from his cap loudly and energetically and stamped it underfoot and said, "This is what we do." And so 71 years later, when Joe Ben-David returned to Prague in 1989, and this was 50 years after he had left as a refugee, this visit, by chance, coincided with a loud, animated uprising by a crowd demanding an end to 40 years of communist domination. This was dubbed the Velvet Revolution, the loud but peaceful demonstration that provoked the police to use water cannons to disperse the demanding crowd. Joseph Ben-David stood nearby in that same Wenceslas Square in the middle of Prague, where his father had spoken up 71 years earlier. Both of these incidents helped to turn power back to the Czech people from outside forces that were controlling them, allowing them to form both the first Czechoslovak Republic and 71 years later, the Czechoslovak Republic led by President Václav Havel.
Okay. Well, as Julian said, we're going to turn our attention to his work, having returned on several visits back to Prague after the Velvet Revolution, when the Czechs were, the Czech Unitarians from the time of Norbert Čapek were able to go back to their church. And we have a wonderful video recording. I hope we have an audio recording that we can play soon.
Yes, we can play audio.
Okay, but before we do that, okay. I have one other person. Where is she? Ivana Edwards. Come forward. Just come stand by me for a minute. Ivana, who's a member, very long-time member of All Souls and UU from way back. And she's one of my closest friends today, and she and Joe worked together very closely on traveling back and forth and establishing contacts between the Czech Unitarians who had had their church hijacked by someone who had, he had defected from Prague, and they called him back. And anyway, our friend in Prague Iva Fiserova is going to tell us about this. But Ivana, I want to tell you that your sister Susie, and your longtime friend Deirdre, how do you say her name? Deirdre. Okay. They are on Zoom together watching you. So, you see that camera over there? You can wave.
Welcome.
Yeah. Isn't that nice? That's so exciting.
Very nice.
All right.
Unexpected.
Thank you. That's great. So now we're going to hear Iva Fiserova,
lovely.
and she's going to tell us.
Okay.
I am deeply touched and honored to contribute to the memorial of Joffe Ben-David, as he became an enormously important supporter of the Czech Unitarians in their complex endeavor to regain their legal status in the 90s. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, Joe visited us for the first time in spring of 1990. Giving his first lecture in Unitaria, he appeared to me to be the real American, and I felt his heart to be the real Czech one. The topic of his talk was love, naturally. Joe was regularly coming back, gladly providing us new insights, supporting our leadership after the time of our isolation. Joe was born here, and in his young age, he engaged in a group of Unitarian youth. Eventually, the war broke out, and Joe had an essential conversation with Čapek, the founder of the Czech Unitarianism and of the Flower Communion. Advised by him, Joe left his native land. And it was in the 90s when the former group of youth welcomed him with open arms. All these people in their 70s were fascinating to me. They were unbelievably vigorous and active, warm-hearted, spirited, positive seniors who blissfully returned to their spiritual home after the decades of religious restrictions. There was a warm atmosphere all around. To me, it was obvious how all of them were equipped by Čapek to live soulful lives. It was quite unique to participate in those lively interactions under Joe's leadership, at the presence of Livia, Čapek's granddaughter, and the American journalist and writer Ivana Edwards, who accompanied Joe so often doing research here. At that time, we all expected only better times to come, but the era became wild, and Unitarians' legal status and property were taken and misused unlawfully by a small group of incomers. Hard to believe it took 7 years to restore the original Unitarians' position. They had splendid stamina to stand for their rightful position as the Secretary General of the Religious Society of Czech Unitarians. I closely co-worked with Joe, along with other forcefully expelled Unitarians. Joe primarily made our cause public abroad immediately. In his undying efforts, he worked until the rightful position was achieved. Few had believed it could happen, but his persistent heart led him to support us. During this time, Unitarian ministers from the US and Great Britain started visiting us, and he arranged for my trip as ambassador to American congregations, which resulted in our moral and material support. Our situation was also made public at the UUA General Assembly. Initiated by Joe, another wave of moral support came in the form of a flood of letters from American Unitarians to our governing institutions, even to President Václav Havel. Joe achieved international awareness of our legal struggle. It was a key moment as after the years of usurping regimes, we lost outstanding binding connections. This astute, unfailing champion of all of us who were spiritually and morally hurt and unlawfully exposed, shared with us his abundant morality and deep love of humanity. Joe was in his deeds fearless, unyielding, loving, humane. I am honored that in my life, in those critical years, our paths crossed. I remember him with love and honor.
The next section of our service is going to include a couple of brief reflections from some of Joe's friends and colleagues.
It certainly is a great pleasure for me to take part in the celebration of Joseph Ben-David's incredible life and service. We actually met when I was living in New York City, and this goes back half a century ago or more, and he was interested in the work that we were doing at the Dream Research Laboratory in parapsychology. So our visit launched into a beautiful friendship, and I was so impressed with the concept of the First Church of Humanism because of my background in humanistic psychology. Now, the humanism as a term has multiple meanings, but when it is applied to churches and religion, like the First Church of Humanism, it takes on a special quality because the early humanists felt that the focus should be on the human being, not on the gods and goddesses or invisible entities of one sort or another that are paramount in most other religions and most other churches. But the First Church of Humanism is humanistic in that it focuses on what can be done to improve the lives and happiness of human beings and how can the church help. That is his goal, and I think he achieved it marvelously. He had an incredible wealth of knowledge, and the services that I went to were a joy, not only in terms of inspiration, but in terms of information. He could impersonate noted people from the past. He could delve into the classics. He could focus on sacred scriptures from many different traditions. And he did this within a humanistic framework. Now, he had the great, I had the great honor of being named by Joe as an advisor for the Humanistic Unitarian Church in Prague, in what was then Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic. And I actually was able to visit the church when I was in Prague, and the minister was extremely dynamic, very well educated, and he had me give a guest sermon Sunday morning when I was in Prague. It was sort of a poignant experience because there were not all that many people in the audience, and most of them were elderly people. And so he asked me the question, what can we do to bring more people, especially young people, into the church? And of course, I cannot speak about another culture. The best I could do was to say, find out something that the church can do that nobody else, that no other humanistic organization in Prague is doing, and focus on that, and then maybe we'll be able to reach some of the young people too. Ironically, the church was on the second floor of a discotheque. And so if somebody could only lure the people from the first floor up to the second floor, his church would be filled. So many times when I was in New York City, I was able to visit both Joe and Alyson and became familiar with the wonderful work that was going on and how much his ministry meant to so many people. So that's my contribution to the celebration. And I certainly join others commemorating this wonderful life passage of Joseph Ben-David.
And when I first met Joe through Stanley Krippner, one of the things that I felt in the past 2 hours here, felt and imagined and felt, is the image of Joe's welcome to me. The and the smile and the warmth that filled and surpassed any location he was in. And my feeling is that the energy of Joe expressed and exemplified any words that would describe the principles of humanism, the humanistic principles rather. I'm sorry, I didn't prepare anything. And the Universalist Church, he practiced what he preached, what they preached, and every element of humanism that I can think of. He was warm, kind, compassionate. One of the things that I think he had in common with my late husband was the love of humor. And he enjoyed a wicked joke or 30, and his smile and his laughter. And so one of the previous speakers said so beautifully how his mind will continue to work as we recall his wisdom, but my imagination will continue to allow me to feel the warmth and compassion of his spirit. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carmine Vacirca. I want to take this opportunity to celebrate Joseph Ben-David's long and productive life as founder and minister of the Church of Humanism. During the past 5 decades, he's had a significant influence on my life, as I'm sure to many of your lives. I first met Joe in the late 70s when I answered an advertisement in the Village Voice, a now defunct weekly newspaper. It was, quote unquote, a hip periodical in New York City at the time. I attended one of the Church of Humanism's social events based on the announcement in this paper. At that time, I was a naive, idealistic, young adult, quite lost, looking for something more of life. At these social events, I felt welcomed, and I realized that something very important was happening here. This was the time when the human potential movement was in full swing. Joe was the moderator of these events, and he was warm and friendly, and he had a way of understanding you and what you were going through. I quickly learned there was more to these events, and as the facilitator, there was more to Joe. It wasn't just about socializing with others, it was about understanding how one relates to others and with oneself. The overall focus was to live a healthier life mentally and spiritually. Through the decades, I attended and participated in many of these social events. I consider myself fortunate to have known and to have worked with Joe and with the church through these many years. I'm honored to say I considered Joe a friend and a life mentor. And I'm also proud to say that his guidance and wisdom helped me become the man I am today. Joe broadened my understanding of what it means to be a compassionate and caring person, to listen and respect others, and not to give in to false narratives and false gods like the ones revered by today's major religions. To see God as ideal reality and to work towards that possibility. That is what God means to me. Through his work as Reverend and moderator of the church, Joe introduced me and some of you to many innovative thinkers and scholars. I don't think I would have come to know much about them and their ideas had I not met Joe and had I not participated in the various church activities. Among these thinkers and scholars are Martin Buber, Erich Fromm, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Wilhelm Reich, Karen Horney, Albert Schweitzer, Giordano Bruno, John Dewey, Hannah Arendt, and many others. I've learned to become a more authentic human being and a humanist by actively participating in many church events and by reading many of the works I was introduced to. As I've grown, I like to think I know myself more. I understand better what God means to me, and I'm more capable of serving God. I recall one memorable lecture series I attended in the early 90s at the All Souls Unitarian Church. Spanning several weeks, Joe focused on Václav Havel's peaceful strategy of quote-unquote living in truth. And the main point was, are we true to ourselves? Are we listening to our core? Or are we living life like automatons? In addition to attending lectures, I also spent many Fridays took the day off from work, cooking with Joe for the Church of Humanism's weekly soup kitchen. While cooking a hearty soup, pea soup, Joe and I spent hours talking about life and what it means to serve God. As I said earlier, Joe has had a significant impact on my life. However, we often don't consider how difficult it must have been for him to live a life of sacrifice and to give his undivided one-on-one attention to others. Joe worked tirelessly promoting what he believed. His passion and his ability to persevere in the face of difficulties and challenges was remarkable. He was always optimistic that we were making progress, regardless of how small the work that moved us forward seemed. And of course, he was always there for you, listening with compassion and understanding. I saw Joe as someone who was strong in character, yet gentle when he related to others. I saw him standing up to his detractors and supporting those in need. Joe dedicated his life to lifting the human spirit in all of us.
Hi, James Cusick. I'm a graduate of Joe's seminar and also his leadership workshop. And I just feel his presence when I come here and notice a technical glitch. One of the greatest things about Joe was he did everything by himself, not only all those thousands of hours of lectures and seminars, but all the technical stuff. There was no sound person for Joe. And there wasn't a single meeting all those years where Joe would actually, in pain, I think of the pain that he went through. He was very guarding of his neurons. And somewhere around his 70th birthday, he would say that when my body wears out, I want my mind to continue on. And so he would suffer the pain in the body, but in a strange sense, he wasn't all suffering. He was in a meditative state. And once I asked Joe, how do you think? Do you think in English or in your native language? And he said, I spend my life in a semi-meditative state. And I think that was the reason so much for his longevity. I just want to mention that there's a chronology I have came out of our archives. Carmen, who just spoke before, has put together a beautiful humanist website. It's the churchofhumanism.org. And just to say that Joe is, he hasn't left us. He did say he wants his mind to continue on. So I just think of Joe as all he's done is change vehicles, and now he's available on the World Wide Web. And his hope for the future will continue on. And I have a chronology that I pulled from our archive that started in 1937 and went through to 2016. In there, Martin Buber is mentioned 17 times. The interesting thing is it didn't start until 1953 with the IHUD. That's when he first mentioned Martin Buber. And on that particular year was a brutal year, most anti-humanistic year maybe in history, with North Korea. And it was very, very hard for people to lay down their arms and leave the people of North Korea in the horrendous suffering that's going on to this very day. And I just feel so strongly that that year seemed to coincide. And I would just leave it with one thing about with Martin Buber is I think this most powerful representative who I can think of would be President Kennedy when he made his famous quote, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. This was Martin Buber through and through. This was the encounter and the dialectic, the decision to make which way to go. And as long as we're doing and see the other person as a person rather than a thing, it's impossible to have discrimination and to have the suffering go on in the world. So thank you.
Making good progress. I wanted to get up and mention something that I had been thinking of saying weeks ago, and it got edited out, and I want to go back to it, and that is to mention that the Church of Humanism gave Humanists of the Year awards in 1979, the Church of Humanism elected Václav Havel and 6 other signers of Charter 77, a pact committed to achieving free governmental elections and removing communist domination. So we awarded them those Humanists of the Year awards, but they were in absentia. they were awarded in absentia because the 6 of them were all imprisoned for their opposition to long years of communist control. After the communists had been ousted and Joseph was back in Prague for a 3-month visit in 1990, the Unitaria of Prague proudly hosted in its sanctuary the awards ceremony for those 6 recipients of the award back in '79. And a bunch of them came, the sanctuary was full, there was all kinds of animation. These people wanted to meet these figures of strength and had been critical in freeing the country. And Václav Havel had been elected president, so he had some other commitment and couldn't come to the ceremony. But they arranged afterward to bring this award up to the castle and deliver it to him there. And that's what I wanted to say. So now we have the blessing of the flowers.
So these beautiful flowers which you chose or brought yourselves are now together in these vases. And flowers symbolize life, rejuvenation, and the promise of continuing life. Springtime, which we're in now, and it's a quandary how to do a humanist blessing. Because when you bless something, you kind of invoke an external spirit. And so if there is any spirit to invoke here, it is the spirit of life, rejuvenation, and the eternal life that we hope will continue on our little planet, our little pale blue dot that sits in this vast, vast universe. So here is the blessing, and I'll ask you to just all put your hands out toward the flowers, and we'll call that our blessing. Okay, flowers are blessed, and you are invited at the end, if you want, to take one with you. But they symbolize all of you here who have come to pay homage and tribute to this amazing human being. So Joe, we're going to applaud you right now with a lot of gusto. And we would be remiss not to understand and honor the incredible sacrifice that Alyson Ben-David has made her whole life to continue, because without Alyson, oh, come on. No, it's true. Joe was able to accomplish things because he didn't have to do, like a 9-to-5 job every day. He worked very hard, but it was Alyson who really was underpinning this whole operation by her labors. Yes. So, and there's one other person here that deserves mention because she received one of the Humanist of the Year. Pam, yeah. So Pam McAllister wrote a book, and it was called, I'm death-defying, and it was all about trying to dismantle the death penalty in this country. And she's a tireless fighter for all sorts of great causes, and she's written a lot of books. So Pam, stand up. Yay. Is there anybody else that we can? Now we're singing. And Julian's going to accompany us on the Ode to Joy of Beethoven. So the words are in your little program there. So sing out with gusto. And if you're able to stand up, that's great.
And this is going to conclude our remembrance of Joe. Please join us for, I'm going to play his favorite song, and when I used to visit him, he would say, my girlfriend plays the violin, and so when we would come, we would have her violin with us, and he used to say, I used to play the violin back when I was a child, and I would play the Humoresque by Dvorak. So we're going to play it, and afterwards, please take a flower and join us for some fellowship and food in the back of the sanctuary. Thank you all for being here.
it on. I'm Carol Herman. I'm Joe's daughter-in-law. I'm married to Dan, who is Joseph's and Erica's son. Our toast begins like this. First, a huge thank you to Alyson for reaching out and creating this wonderful gathering. The beautiful service, filled with warm memories, was deeply meaningful. We are also grateful to the many participants for sharing their thoughts and talents and hearts with us. Alyson, you have succeeded in creating an amazing tribute to an amazing man. This day will stay with us always. You can be very proud.
And I am Dan. And I just wanted to say that I remember when I was 15 years old at summer camp, and my father, Joe, visited me with this cute little red head with freckles. And she was only 7 years older than I. And she remains 7 years older than I. So I'm not going to give away her age, but I'm 69. And I've been... So I have Parkinson's disease, and I have been struggling for 18 years. And I owe a lot of my resilience to my dad and my mom, who are both survivors. But I wanted to say it makes me happy to remember that Dad's father, Joe's father, Gustav, and Joe himself and I were all chemists. They worked with inks in the printing business. My specialty was automated hematology, but it's all chemistry. A memory that I have of my dad may resonate with you too. As a father, he was sensitive, intimate, and fun. He held me and showed his affection often. He always believed in kissing on the lips, even into his late 90s. He would share his passion for doing and his skills for tools, sports, photography, and the outdoors. He taught me to develop film when I was 8 years old and make black and white prints with an enlarger. To this day, I love photography, and I'm known at my Unitarian congregation as the photographer. Also, he got me into multimedia world because of many audio and video recordings he made of his speeches and events. He had a great sense of confidence even when trying something new. Most of all, he was passionate about his belief in justice and peace. I can tell you a memory when I was in 4th grade. Joe was standing on a car down in the village, speaking through a bullhorn about the war in Vietnam. This was 1965 when the war was starting to escalate. LBJ had been elected in a landslide victory shortly before. The president and the war were still fairly popular, including at my school. But Joe standing on a car with a bullhorn, speaking against the war and for peace. He was getting heckled, but he was undaunted. My dad was passionate about relating to people with love, rationality, and intuitive awareness. Thank you, and a toast to my dad.
So thank you to everyone in person and online. We will raise glasses to Joseph or Pepik Ben-David, a thoughtful and joyful man. May we carry his love with us and some of his warmth and patience and humor in our own daily lives.